On the 2nd of July, 2025, in a research building in London, a small team of scientists at the Francis Crick Institute stared at a computer screen showing something that should not have been possible. In their hands, or rather inside their machines, was the complete genetic code of a man who had been dead for almost 5,000 years. Not a fragment, not a partial reading. The entire genome, fully sequenced from a human being who was alive and breathing before the Great Pyramid of Giza, had even finished being built. And when they compared his DNA against everything science thought it knew about the origins of the ancient Egyptians, the numbers did not match the story that had been taught in classrooms and museums for over a century. 1 in every 5 pieces of this man's genetic code did not come from the Nile Valley at all. It came from hundreds of miles away, from the region we now call Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. For the first time in history, scientists were not just guessing based on pottery, art, or trade records. They were holding hard, physical, genetic proof that thousands of years ago, real human beings had actually walked out of Mesopotamia, crossed the desert, and became part of the founding population of ancient Egypt. Now sit with that for a moment, because this is not a theory pulled from a documentary or a wild claim from the internet. This is a peer-reviewed study published in the scientific journal Nature, carried out by researchers from the Francis Crick Institute and Liverpool John Moores University, right here in Britain. And it did something that 40 years of failed attempts before it could never manage. It cracked open the oldest surviving human genome ever recovered from ancient Egypt, and in doing so, it reopened one of the oldest and most sensitive arguments in all of archaeology, the argument over where the ancient Egyptians actually came from and how much of their civilization was shaped by outside influence. Today we are going to walk through this entire story from the very beginning, the strange journey of one man's body across 5,000 years, 2 world wars, and one of the most difficult scientific puzzles in modern genetics. And by the end, you will understand exactly why this single skeleton managed to shake an entire academic debate that experts thought had been quietly settled decades ago. And before you assume this is just another archaeology headline that will be forgotten in a week, understand exactly how rare this discovery actually is. Egypt's blistering desert climate has destroyed almost every attempt scientists have made to recover usable ancient DNA from its people. For decades, the country that gave the world mummification, the pyramids, and some of the most well-preserved physical remains in human history turned out to be one of the single worst places on Earth to actually extract readable genetic material, which makes what happened in that London laboratory even more remarkable. Out of countless failed attempts stretching back 40 years, one single skeleton, pulled from a hillside tomb by British archaeologists over a century ago, somehow held onto its secrets long enough for modern science to finally catch up. Let's go all the way back to where the story actually starts, because the beginning of this tale has almost nothing to do with laboratories or DNA sequencing machines. It starts in 1902 in a place called Nuanced, a small site around 265 kilometers south of Cairo, tucked into a limestone hillside. British archaeologists working in the area were excavating a series of tombs cut directly into the rock, and inside one of them, they found something unusual. Most burials from this period followed fairly predictable patterns, but this one was different. The remains of a man had been placed, knees curled up toward his chin, inside a large sealed ceramic pot, and then set into a tomb carved straight into the hillside. At the time, nobody had any idea what they had actually found. There was no way in 1902 to know that this particular skeleton would one day become the single most genetically important human body ever recovered from ancient Egypt. The remains were shipped back to England and eventually ended up at what is now the World Museum in Liverpool, where they sat, largely undisturbed, for decades. And here's where the story takes its first genuinely dramatic turn. During the Second World War, the city of Liverpool was hit repeatedly by German bombing raids as part of what became known as the Liverpool Blitz. Entire streets were flattened. Museums and collections across the city were damaged or destroyed. And yet, somehow, this 5,000-year-old skeleton survived. It sat through explosions, fires, and the collapse of buildings around it, and came out the other side almost completely intact. Think about that for a second. A body that had already survived nearly 5 millennia inside an Egyptian tomb went on to survive a modern world war as well, tucked away in storage while bombs fell on the city around it. Picture the sheer improbability of that chain of events for a moment. A man dies in Egypt roughly 4,800 years ago. His body is sealed inside a pot, hidden inside a rock-cut tomb, and left completely undisturbed for close to 4,700 years. Then, in 1902, strangers dig him up, ship him across the Mediterranean and through Europe, and place him inside a museum in a country he never knew existed. Just decades later, that same museum finds itself sitting in the middle of one of the most heavily bombed cities in Britain during the deadliest conflict in human history. Bombs fall, buildings collapse, fires burn through the night, and through all of it, this one skeleton, already older than almost anything else in the building, somehow makes it through untouched. It's the kind of survival story that sounds like something out of a novel, except every part of it actually happened. For most of the 20th century, that would have been the end of the story, a remarkable survival tale filed away in a museum archive, with no real way for scientists to unlock what was actually hiding inside those bones. Because here's the problem that had haunted researchers for decades. Egypt's climate is genetics research's worst nightmare. DNA breaks down over time no matter what, but heat dramatically speeds up that process. Ancient DNA researchers love working with remains from places like Siberia, Scandinavia, or deep frozen caves, because cold temperatures act almost like a natural freezer, preserving genetic material for tens of thousands of years. Egypt offers the exact opposite conditions: blistering heat, and for mummified remains specifically, chemical embalming processes that actively destroy genetic material rather than preserve it. For decades, this meant that ancient Egyptian genetics was considered one of the most frustrating and unreliable corners of the entire field. In fact, the very first attempt at extracting DNA from an ancient Egyptian happened all the way back in 1985, carried out by a young geneticist named Svante Pääbo. If that name sounds familiar, it should, because decades later in 2022, Pääbo would go on to win the Nobel Prize for his groundbreaking work sequencing Neanderthal DNA, work that essentially created the entire modern field of ancient DNA research. But back in 1985, working with the far more limited technology of the time, Pääbo's early Egyptian mummy DNA results turned out to be deeply unreliable, heavily contaminated by modern DNA from the many people who had handled their remains over the decades. It was a noble first attempt, but it left the door only barely open. For the next 40 years, no one managed to successfully sequence a complete, reliable genome from ancient Egypt. Partial results existed here and there, focused on the 3 ancient Egyptian individuals studied through what is called target-enriched sequencing, essentially fishing for tiny specific markers rather than reading the whole genetic code. And even those samples came from a much later period of Egyptian history, between around 787 BC and AD 23, over 2,000 years, after the time period this new study was about to unlock. It's worth pausing here to really appreciate what those 40 years of failure actually meant for the field. Generation after generation of geneticists tried, in one form or another, to crack open the genetic secrets of ancient Egypt, and generation after generation walked away empty-handed, defeated by heat, contamination, and the simple, brutal reality that DNA molecules break down faster in hot climates than almost anywhere else on the planet. Some researchers had quietly begun to wonder whether a truly complete, reliable ancient Egyptian genome would ever be possible at all, whether the desert itself had simply erased that particular chapter of human history beyond any hope of scientific recovery. That's the weight of expectation and the weight of decades of disappointment sitting behind this single 2025 breakthrough. So when the team from the Francis Crick Institute and Liverpool John Moores University decided to take another shot at this old, half-abandoned skeleton sitting in storage since 1902, they knew they were fighting against decades of failure and an environment that had destroyed almost every previous attempt. But this time, they had something researchers in 1985 could only have dreamed of: 40 years of massive advances in DNA sequencing technology, and a much smarter approach to where, inside the human body, ancient DNA actually survives best. Instead of targeting bone tissue directly, which tends to degrade badly in hot climates, the team focused on the man's teeth, specifically a layer called the cementum, a dense, mineral-rich tissue that forms around the roots of teeth. Cementum has a strange advantage over almost every other part of the human skeleton. It's incredibly resistant to environmental damage, almost like a tiny, naturally sealed vault protecting whatever genetic material happens to be locked inside it. Research comparing different types of ancient skeletal material has consistently shown that teeth and the dense bone found deep inside the skull tend to preserve genetic information far better than more exposed bone, precisely because they are so tightly sealed off from the outside environment. When the researchers carefully extracted material from 2 of the man's teeth and began sequencing it, they finally got what nobody had managed to get in over a century of trying: a complete, high-quality, whole genome sequence from an ancient Egyptian individual older than anything ever recovered before. Using radiocarbon dating, the team was able to pin down almost exactly when this man had lived. His remains dated to somewhere between 2855 and 2570 BC, which places him right at the transition between Egypt's early dynastic period and the beginning of the Old Kingdom, the era we now think of as the Age of the Pyramids. To put that in perspective, this man was likely alive around the time the very first pyramid in Egyptian history, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, was either recently completed or actively under construction. He may have lived to see the earliest beginnings of the pyramid-building era that would go on to define ancient Egypt in the minds of people thousands of years later. This made his genome, once fully decoded, not just the oldest complete Egyptian genome ever sequenced, but a genetic snapshot frozen at one of the single most important turning points in the entire history of the civilization. And once the sequencing was finished and the results were run through comparative analysis against genetic databases from populations all across North Africa and the Middle East, the team found something that immediately reopened one of archaeology's oldest and most sensitive debates. Roughly 80% of this man's genetic ancestry traced back to populations connected to North Africa, closely aligned with ancient groups from the wider Nile Valley region, and going back even further to Neolithic populations linked to areas like ancient Morocco. That part on its own was not shocking. It confirmed something researchers had generally suspected, that ancient Egyptian civilization grew primarily out of long-standing local North African populations who had lived along the Nile for thousands of years before the pyramids were ever built. But then there was the other 20%. Roughly 1/5 of this man's entire genetic code traced back to populations from the Eastern Fertile Crescent, the region historians associate with ancient Mesopotamia, covering areas of what is now Iraq and parts of the surrounding Middle East. For decades, archaeologists had noticed strange similarities between early Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations. Certain styles of pottery, aspects of early writing systems, elements of urban planning and administration that seemed to echo each other across a huge stretch of desert separating the two regions. But historians had always been forced to explain these similarities through trade and cultural exchange alone, the idea that ideas, goods, and artistic styles had simply traveled along ancient trade routes, carried by merchants and travelers, without necessarily involving large numbers of actual people relocating permanently. This new genome changed that assumption in a single stroke, because DNA does not travel through trade routes. DNA travels inside human bodies, through birth, through families, through generations. If this man was carrying real, measurable Mesopotamian ancestry inside his own genetic code, it meant that real people, not just ideas and pottery styles, had physically migrated from the Fertile Crescent into Egypt, settled there, and had children with the local population long before the age of the pyramids even began. Think about how long this particular question had been sitting unanswered in academic circles. Scholars have been staring at similarities between early Egyptian and Mesopotamian material culture for well over 100 years, ever since archaeologists first began seriously excavating sites from this period across the wider Middle East and North Africa. Entire academic careers have been built around debating exactly how much contact existed between these two ancient centers of civilization, and whether that contact ever went beyond simple trade. Textbooks have presented cautious, hedged language for generations, phrases like possible cultural influence or evidence of exchange, because nobody had a way to prove anything stronger than that. A single genome, pulled from two ancient teeth, just settled a debate that had outlived multiple generations of scholars who spent entire careers arguing about it without ever having actual biological proof either way. This is genuinely one of the most significant findings to come out of ancient DNA research in years, because it takes something historians had only ever been able to infer indirectly, based on comparing artifacts and guessing at connections, and turns it into hard, undeniable biological proof. Human movement had accompanied those cultural links between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Not just goods on the backs of camels, but actual families, actual bloodlines, weaving themselves into what would eventually become one of the greatest civilizations in human history. The researchers were careful to point out that they cannot say exactly when this mixing happened. It may have occurred gradually over hundreds or even thousands of years, generation after generation of small-scale intermarriage, slowly blending two distant populations together. Or it might have involved distinct, more concentrated waves of migration at specific points in time. What the DNA proves beyond doubt is that it happened, whenever and however it unfolded. At the same time, and this part is just as important as the migration discovery itself, the study made something else very clear. Ancient Egypt was not some kind of colony, imported wholesale from Mesopotamia, the way some more sensational theories over the years have tried to claim. The dominant portion of this man's ancestry, that 80% North African component, reflects a population that had been established and continuous in the region for a very long time before any Mesopotamian influence arrived. There is no evidence in this genome of any kind of population replacement, no sign that an entire outside civilization simply marched in and took over. Instead, what the data actually shows is something far more nuanced and, in a way, far more human. A long-standing local population, already deeply rooted along the Nile, gradually absorbing new genetic influence from a neighboring region, through generations of contact, movement, and intermarriage. Isotope analysis carried out on the man's own teeth backed this up beautifully, confirming that he himself was raised locally in the Nile Valley, meaning that Mesopotamian ancestry had entered his family line at some earlier point, generations before his own birth, and had simply become part of who he, and presumably many others around him, already were. Now, as fascinating as all of this genetic data is on its own, the story of this individual man gets even stranger once researchers turned their attention away from his DNA and toward his actual physical remains. Because his skeleton told a story that seemed, at first glance, to directly contradict itself. His burial was elaborate. Being sealed inside a large ceramic vessel and placed in a rock-cut tomb was not the standard treatment given to an average person in ancient Egyptian society. This style of burial strongly suggested he held some kind of elevated social status, someone respected, someone who mattered enough to receive special treatment in death. And yet, when researchers examined his bones closely, they found clear physical evidence of a life filled with hard, repetitive manual labor. His seat bones were noticeably expanded in size. His arms showed clear signs of extensive, repeated back-and-forth movement over many years. And most tellingly of all, he had substantial arthritis concentrated specifically in his right foot, a very unusual and specific pattern of wear. According to the researchers, this exact combination of physical markers points toward one particular profession above all others, pottery making, and specifically the use of a foot-powered pottery wheel, a technology that was just beginning to take hold in Egypt during this exact period of history. Sitting cross-legged for hours, spinning clay with repetitive arm motion, while working a wheel mechanism with one foot pressed down again and again, would explain almost perfectly the specific pattern of stress and wear found across his skeleton. Radiocarbon and skeletal analysis placed his age at death somewhere between 44 and 64 years old, remarkably old for someone living through a lifetime of hard manual labor in ancient Egypt, and his estimated height came in at around 160 centimeters, a little over 5 feet tall. Every piece of physical evidence lines up to paint the picture of a working man, a skilled craftsman who spent decades of his life hunched over a wheel, shaping clay by hand day after day, year after year. So how does someone who spent his life doing hard, physically punishing manual labor end up buried with the kind of elaborate ceremony normally reserved for Egypt's elite? The most compelling explanation researchers have put forward comes down to something that feels surprisingly familiar even today: exceptional skill leading to social mobility. Ancient Egyptian society, much like societies throughout human history, was not entirely rigid. There is growing evidence that individuals who displayed extraordinary talent in a particular craft could, in certain circumstances, rise well beyond the social position they were born into. It's entirely possible that this man was simply one of the very best potters of his era, so skilled at his craft that his community or his patrons chose to honor him in death with a burial usually reserved for people of a much higher social class. In a strange way, his bones tell the story of exactly how hard he worked, while his tomb tells the story of how much that work was ultimately valued and respected by the people around him. To bring this ancient craftsman back into something resembling a living, breathing human face, the research team turned to forensic anthropologist Caroline Wilkinson, who leads the Face Lab at Liverpool John Moores University. Wilkinson is no stranger to reconstructing the faces of major historical figures, having previously recreated the likeness of Rameses II and Arsinoe IV, the sister of the famous Cleopatra. Working from a detailed three-dimensional scan of the man's skull, she carefully rebuilt his facial structure piece by piece, starting with features that can be predicted with reasonable confidence directly from bone structure alone. Things like the shape of his jawline, the position and structure of his nose, and the general placement of his eyes. Features like the ears and the exact shape of the mouth are far more difficult to reconstruct with any real accuracy from bone alone, so those elements involved a greater degree of educated estimation. Even so, the final result gave the world something remarkable: an actual face, staring back across nearly 5,000 years of history, belonging to a real person who lived, worked, and eventually died during the earliest days of one of the most legendary civilizations humanity has ever built. What makes this entire discovery hit differently compared to a lot of other ancient DNA stories is just how much it manages to blend together in one single human life. This was not some vague, faceless statistic buried in a spreadsheet of genetic data. This was one specific man with a specific job, specific injuries, a specific age at death, and now, thanks to modern forensic science, a specific face. And woven directly into his own body, quite literally inside his own teeth, was physical proof of a migration story that connects two of the ancient world's greatest civilizations, Egypt and Mesopotamia, in a way that historians had suspected for decades, but had never been able to prove until this very moment. Of course, scientists are also very careful to point out the limits of what a single genome can actually tell us, and this is worth being honest about, because it's easy to get carried away with a discovery this dramatic. This is the genetic story of exactly one man. A single individual, no matter how well preserved or how significant his life turns out to have been, cannot single-handedly represent the genetic makeup of an entire nation across thousands of years of history. His high-status burial might mean his particular family line or social circle experienced different patterns of migration and mixing compared to farmers, laborers, or people living in entirely different regions of ancient Egypt at the exact same time. The same brutal desert conditions that destroyed almost every other attempt at ancient Egyptian DNA sequencing for over a century mean that finding another sample this well preserved from this same time period may prove incredibly difficult, or take years, or simply never happen at all. Regional variation across ancient Egypt, differences between people living in the north versus the south, along the coast versus deep inland, remains almost completely unexplored simply because so few other ancient samples have survived in a state good enough to sequence. But even with those limitations openly acknowledged by the researchers themselves, the significance of this single genome is genuinely hard to overstate. For over a century, arguments about the true origins of the ancient Egyptians have swirled around, fueled by pottery fragments, art styles, architectural similarities, and educated guesswork stitched together from indirect evidence. This is the first time actual, physical, undeniable genetic proof has entered that conversation, pulled directly from the body of a man who lived through the exact period historians have been arguing about for generations. It does not settle every question. If anything, it opens up dozens of new ones. But it fundamentally shifts the debate from theory and speculation into the realm of hard biological evidence. And that shift matters enormously for how we understand not just ancient Egypt, but the wider connected world it grew out of. It's also worth remembering just how loaded the question of ancient Egyptian origins has historically been, well beyond the walls of academia. For generations, arguments about who the ancient Egyptians really were have spilled out of university departments and into much wider, sometimes deeply politicized public debates, shaped as much by modern identity and ideology as by actual evidence. A single, carefully sequenced genome cannot and should not be used to settle those much larger cultural arguments on its own, and the researchers behind this study were notably cautious about overstating their conclusions for exactly that reason. What this genome does offer is something far more modest, and in many ways far more valuable: one honest, direct data point, pulled from one real human being who actually lived through the period in question, added carefully to a much larger and still unfinished puzzle that historians, archaeologists, and geneticists will keep piecing together for years to come. Because when you step back and really think about what this story represents, it becomes something much bigger than just one skeleton in a museum drawer. It's proof that the ancient world was far more connected, far more full of movement and mixing and shared humanity than the neat, separate boxes we often place ancient civilizations into inside history books. Egypt was not an isolated bubble that spontaneously invented itself in a vacuum along the banks of the Nile. It was shaped, at least in part, by people who came from somewhere else entirely, who crossed deserts and mountains and settled among a population that was already there, and whose descendants went on to help build one of the most awe-inspiring civilizations the human species has ever produced. Somewhere in the blending of those two ancient populations, North African river valley communities and Mesopotamian newcomers from the east, the world got the first pyramids, the pharaohs, the hieroglyphs, and thousands of years of history that still fascinates us today. And all of that connection, all of that lost history, survived hidden inside two small teeth, sealed away for nearly 5,000 years. First inside a ceramic pot in a hillside tomb, then inside a museum drawer that somehow made it through a world war completely intact, waiting patiently for the exact right combination of scientific technology and human curiosity to finally come along and unlock what had been sitting there in silence the entire time. It makes you wonder just how many other stories like this one are still out there right now, sitting quietly in museum storage rooms and forgotten archaeological sites around the world, waiting for someone, someday, to finally ask the right question, use the right technology, and let a 5,000-year-old life speak again. Because if one ordinary-looking clay jar from 1902 could end up rewriting a debate that historians and archaeologists had been having for well over 100 years, then the story of human history is nowhere near as finished or as settled as most of us like to assume. Every so often, science reaches back into the deep past, pulls out a single life, a single set of bones, a single strand of ancient DNA, and reminds all of us that the people who lived thousands of years before we did were not distant, abstract characters from a textbook. They were real. They worked hard jobs. They had families. They carried, quite literally inside their own bodies, the memory of journeys and migrations that connected entire regions of the ancient world together in ways we are only now beginning to fully understand. And somewhere out there, in another quiet museum drawer or another undisturbed tomb, there may be another face, another genome, and another chapter of human history, still waiting patiently to finally be heard. Think about the strange, almost impossible chain of events required for us to even be having this conversation today. A man works his entire life bent over a potter's wheel, wearing down his own bones through decades of repetitive motion. He dies, is honored with an elaborate burial that his physical labor alone would not normally have earned him, and is sealed away inside a sealed ceramic jar for nearly 5,000 years. Strangers from a country he could never have imagined dig him up in 1902 and carry him across the sea. His remains survive bombs falling on Liverpool during the deadliest war in human history. And then, decades later, in a modern laboratory using technology that would have sounded like pure fantasy. To the archaeologists who first found him, scientists reach into two of his teeth and pull out the actual genetic memory of a migration that reshaped the ancient world. Every single link in that chain had to hold for this discovery to happen. Break any one of them, and this story simply never gets told. And that, in the end, is really what makes this discovery so much bigger than just a headline about ancient DNA. It's a reminder of how fragile and how incredibly lucky our access to deep human history actually is. For every genome like this one that manages to survive against impossible odds, there are almost certainly countless others that never will, lost to heat, to time, to the simple chemistry of decay that erases most of what came before us. This single man, this potter who lived and worked and died right at the dawn of the Pyramid Age, beat those odds. And in doing so, he handed modern science a piece of proof that generations of scholars had spent their entire careers arguing about without ever being able to settle. Somewhere in the mixing of his ancestors, a Nile Valley population that had called this land home for thousands of years, and a Mesopotamian population that crossed deserts and mountains to become part of it, the story of ancient Egypt as we understand it today quietly began to take shape. And nearly 5,000 years later, that story finally found its way back to the surface, not carved into stone or painted onto tomb walls, but written in the oldest and most personal language any human being can leave behind, their own DNA.